This is a piece of racing history here in Daytona Beach. The last part of famed NASCAR mechanic Smokey Yunick's garage was gutted by fire tonight and is being called suspicious.
There's a version of this story that people love to tell at bars and swap meets. The idea that when Smokey Yunick died, his family had to call in federal agents to quietly haul away a stash of illegal engines and banned blueprints before the public ever got a look. It's a great campfire tale. It's also almost entirely wrong. What actually happened at 957 North Beach Street in Daytona Beach was stranger, messier, and honestly more impressive than any conspiracy theory could invent. No black vans. No sealed vault. Just a garage door rolled up, a crowd of ordinary fans with cash in their pockets, and one of the strangest, most brilliant workshops in American racing history laid bare for anyone willing to show up. So let's talk about what was actually found, because the truth doesn't need embellishing. It's already unbelievable enough on its own. Smokey Yunick passed away on May 9, 2001, at age 77, after spending roughly a year fighting leukemia. He died at home in Daytona Beach, the same city where he'd built his reputation as one of the most inventive, most rule-bending minds motorsports has ever produced. By the time he passed, though, his legendary shop had already been dark for over a decade. He closed the best damn garage in town back in 1987, reportedly because he felt the well of genuinely great mechanics had run dry and the work no longer interested him the way it once had. For years after that, the building just sat there, not guarded, not sealed, just quiet, the way old workshops tend to go when nobody's paying attention to them anymore. It wasn't until his family began working through his estate that the doors finally opened again. And when they did, it wasn't a private auction for collectors with deep pockets. It was a full-blown public garage sale during Speed Weeks in February 2002, and it drew people from as far away as Maine and Oregon. These weren't investors. They were fans who'd grown up hearing Smokey's name and wanted to own a piece of it, even if that piece was a $5 hammer. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. A $5 hammer sitting on a folding table next to $20 boxes of used racing parts. Stacks of old hubcaps. A vintage GMC dealership sign from the 1950s. Smokey's own well-worn manual typewriter. The machine he probably used to draft angry letters to NASCAR officials. And then, sitting almost casually among all of it, an engine Smokey claimed could deliver 80 miles per gallon, priced at $20,000. That's the real image people should have in their heads. Not a hidden laboratory. A crowded workshop that looked exactly like what it was. The physical residue of a lifetime spent building, testing, and arguing with the establishment. Marge Yunick, Smokey's widow, described the sale in a way that stuck with fans for over 2 decades. She called it a junkyard, but a first-class one. It's hard to find a better summary, because that's genuinely what it was, clutter and genius sitting side by side, with no velvet rope separating the two. Marge also explained the philosophy behind opening the doors to the public instead of quietly selling everything off to a museum or a private collector. Smokey wanted his tools and parts to keep working. He wanted them in the hands of people who would actually use them, or, at the very least, people who would treasure them as pieces of his story rather than locking them away behind glass where nobody could touch them. That tracks with everything we know about the man. Smokey spent much of his career rescuing forgotten machines and getting them running again. The idea of his own life's work ending up untouchable and roped off in some sterile museum display would have been the opposite of what he stood for. There was also a practical purpose behind the sale. The proceeds were meant to fund a foundation supporting innovation in motorsports, an effort to keep that same experimental spirit alive in future generations of mechanics and engineers. His daughter, Trish Yunick Brown, said something during that period that's worth sitting with. While plenty of people wanted the physical objects from the shop, she said she was holding on to something more valuable than any tool or engine: his stories. Her husband, Chris Brown, once described Smokey as NASCAR's wildest cheater, and he didn't mean it as an insult. He meant it as a badge of honor. Smokey spent decades finding legal gray areas in the rulebook that forced officials to rewrite it over and over again. So picture the contrast. Instead of a secretive government seizure, instead of a midnight raid by nervous NASCAR officials, the real story is a public sale where regular people bought ordinary tools right alongside extraordinary, borderline experimental machinery. And even after the property itself was sold off in 2003, and the last remaining building eventually burned down in a fire on April 25, 2011, none of that erased what had already happened. The real legacy wasn't sitting in that building anymore. It had already scattered out into garages, workshops, and private collections all across the country. Buried among the hammers and dealership signs were engines that had no business being sold at a garage sale for pocket change. These weren't hobbyist tinkering projects. They were prototypes that General Motors' own engineers had tested, verified, and ultimately walked away from. Not because they didn't work, but because they worked in a way the industry wasn't ready to embrace. The crown jewel of the entire collection was Smokey's hot vapor engine, built around a modified 2.5-liter Pontiac Fiero Iron Duke 4-cylinder. In stock form, that engine was nothing special, about 90 horsepower and roughly 35 miles per gallon on the highway. Smokey's version, running on a carburetor rather than any kind of computer-controlled fuel injection, produced 250 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque. It dropped the 0 to 60 time to around 6.5 seconds, and it still managed 51 miles per gallon on 93-octane fuel. Read that again. Nearly triple the horsepower, a dramatically quicker sprint time, and better fuel economy than the stock engine it was built from. In the 1980s, without a single line of engine management code. The trick behind it is called adiabatic combustion, and the plain language version goes something like this. Instead of trying to cool the air-fuel mixture the way conventional engines do, Smokey used waste heat pulled from the exhaust and coolant to boil it instead. The mixture pushed through an exhaust-driven turbine positioned under the carburetor. Smokey called it a homogenizer, and traveled through a wrapped manifold until temperatures climbed past 450 degrees Fahrenheit. That heat completely vaporized the fuel, which allowed the engine to run at an extremely lean air-to-fuel ratio, north of 20 to 1. For context, most gasoline engines run somewhere around 14.7 to 1. Detroit's own engineers verified these numbers in their labs, and the engine still met the strict emissions standards of the era, all without any of the electronic controls modern cars rely on to hit similar marks. The concept itself wasn't entirely new. It traced back to the 1950s, and a man named Ralph Johnson, a Holley carburetor specialist and a dyno technician at General Motors, who partnered with Smokey on the idea. Together, they figured out how to push right up against the edge of detonation, running exhaust temperatures around 2,250 degrees to control the hydrogen burn happening inside the combustion chamber. Johnson later summed up their approach to lean burn tuning with a line that says everything about how close to the edge they were operating. The car never ran as well as it did right before it let go. They didn't stop at one prototype. Over the years, they built a 3-cylinder Buick, a modified Ford, and a Dodge Omni, all running versions of the hot vapor system. Every one of those test vehicles exceeded 45 miles per gallon and produced close to 2 horsepower per cubic inch, numbers that would still turn heads today. There were even close calls with production. An S10 truck project got far enough along to be a real possibility, and there was a licensing conversation with crane cams. None of it made it to market. The technology eventually collapsed under the weight of durability concerns, legal costs, high manufacturing expenses, and what people in the industry sometimes call not invented here syndrome. The tendency of large companies to reject good ideas simply because they didn't originate in-house. But here's the thing. The engines themselves survived. Trish kept 4 of them in the family. An enthusiast named Tony Allers eventually acquired the running examples and built a beautifully restored, honest-to-goodness daily driver out of a Fiero replica using the salvaged original drivetrain. He drove that car for years, actually using it exactly the way Smokey would have wanted. On Christmas Day in 2009, Allers donated the car to the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing, where it remains on display today. Another one of these hot vapor units is reportedly housed at the Smithsonian. Sit with that for a second. A carbureted 4-cylinder engine from the 1980s. hitting 250 horsepower and 51 miles per gallon while meeting emission standards. And Detroit let it die because nobody wanted to deal with the paperwork and the internal politics of adopting someone else's idea. The hot vapor secrets partly went to the grave with Smokey, since he never fully documented every detail of the tuning process. But a lot of what he was working on left a very clear paper trail, because patents are essentially a legal timestamp proving exactly when an idea was born. According to United States Patent and Trademark Office records, Smokey secured at least 9 patents between 1978 and 1996, and together they read like a man methodically trying to solve problems the industry wasn't yet willing to admit existed. A cluster of those patents came directly out of his hot vapor research, filed between 1984 and 1988. They covered the actual apparatus, the operating methods, and the fuel conditioning systems tied to the internal combustion setups that powered those experimental Fieros. Those patents entered the public domain around 2003, meaning anyone, any engineer or researcher, could study them freely from that point forward. He didn't stop there. In 1978, he registered a patent for a pressure vent. In 1991, he patented an oil change system. In 1994, he secured a patent covering engine testing methods. These weren't flashy headline inventions, but they show a mechanic who was constantly formalizing his shop floor ideas into something the rest of the industry could theoretically build on. His most frustrating fights, though, weren't really about engines at all. They were about safety and aerodynamics and NASCAR's willingness to listen. Back in 1961, Smokey developed pneumatic air jacks designed to lift stock cars instantly during pit stops. NASCAR rejected the idea outright, calling it inappropriate for the series. The following year, he mounted a massive wing over the engine of Jim Rathman's Simona's Vista Special Watson Roadster for the Indy 500. That wing generated serious downforce and improved cornering dramatically, but it also created too much drag on the straightaways, and the United States Auto Club banned it almost immediately. Decades later, wings became mandatory, standard equipment across Can-Am, Formula One, and IndyCar. The idea wasn't wrong. It was just early. The most painful example, though, involves safety barriers. In the early 1980s, long before anything resembling the modern safer barrier existed, Smokey designed a rough soft wall concept using old tires sandwiched between heavy sheets of plywood, meant to absorb impact energy instead of returning it straight back into the car and driver. NASCAR didn't adopt it. Drivers kept racing against solid concrete walls for years afterward. Smokey eventually formalized his thinking into a 1996 patent describing a racetrack design with a novel crash barrier system. It's worth wondering, honestly, how many injuries, or worse, might have been prevented if that idea had been taken seriously in 1982 instead of being revisited decades later once the sport had no choice but to modernize. If you spent any time around old racing photos, you've probably seen the shot of Smokey standing next to a Chevelle, cigar in his mouth, wearing that crooked grin that shows up in almost every picture of him. That car usually gets captioned as the 7/8 scale Chevelle, supposedly a shrunken version of the real thing that snuck past inspectors. It's a fun story. It's also not true, and the actual measurements make that obvious. A genuine 7/8 scale car would have been nearly 10 inches narrower, more than 2 feet shorter, and built on a 100-inch wheelbase. That kind of difference would have been obvious to literally anyone walking past it in the garage, let alone a NASCAR tech inspector. So what was actually going on? The real story involves 3 1966 bodied Chevelles, cars often mistakenly labeled as 1967 models by casual fans. Chevrolet engineering had already done serious developmental work on the underlying platform, and Smokey layered his own finishing touches on top of that foundation. And those touches were subtle, almost sculptural changes rather than a wholesale resizing of the car. He shifted the body about 2 inches backward on the chassis to improve weight distribution. He smoothed and raised the floor pan to manage airflow underneath the car. He lowered the roof and windows just slightly, raked the windshield back a bit more aggressively, and reshaped the fenders and drip rails. He even modified the front bumper, raising it slightly to function as a crude aerodynamic spoiler. The sheet metal itself was largely stock, What changed was the geometry, sculpted piece by piece to cut through the air more efficiently, at speeds over 180 miles per hour. Changes that small can mean the difference between a car that's competitive and one that dominates. When NASCAR inspectors eventually noticed something was off, they tried to build their first ever inspection templates using a wrecked Chevelle that had been driven by Bobby Johns as their reference pattern. It caused chaos during inspection and ultimately forced NASCAR to mandate standardized roof, hood, and trunk templates across the entire field, a practice that continues in some form to this day. And the engineering behind Smokey's version genuinely worked. Driving one of these cars, Curtis Turner became the first driver to qualify at over 180 miles per hour at Daytona. Smokey himself pushed back on the pure scale model myth directly, addressing it in a 1987 Circle Track magazine interview and later again in his autobiography, explaining that his modifications were far more calculated than a simple resizing job. That mindset shows up everywhere in his career. He exploited fuel capacity rules by running an 11-foot coil of 2-inch tubing as his fuel line, a trick that added roughly 5 extra gallons of usable fuel capacity to the car. Racing folklore is full of stories about his cars having offset chassis components and mysteriously empty fuel tanks right after post-race inspections. Smokey's own justification, in his own words, was blunt. He believed everyone else was cheating 10 times worse than he was, so bending the rules was simply self-defense. While fans were hauling away hammers and the hot vapor engines were finding new homes in museums and private garages, Smokey was quietly finishing the most complete record of his own mind. An autobiography he raced to complete as leukemia closed in on him. That manuscript ran over 1,100 pages. It was published posthumously around 2001 through Carbon Press, working with his family under the title Best Damn Garage in Town. It came out as a massive 3-volume boxed set containing more than 400 photographs, split across volumes covering his personal life, his years in stock car racing, and his work in Indy 500 competition and mechanical invention. John DeLorean, of all people, narrated the audiobook version,